Welcome to Strain on the Game, the podcast that reveals what it really takes to keep elite footballers performing at the highest level. I'm Stephen Warnock, former Premier League player, joined by physical performance expert Adrian. From training ground truths to the financial impact of fitness, we discuss the often overlooked challenges behind the beautiful game. Welcome to another episode of Strain on the Game. Football injuries are at an all-time high. Last season, Premier League clubs racked up 593 time-loss injuries, costing players 2,597 games and clubs more than 255 million in wages. Hamstring injuries alone have doubled in the past 21 years, despite clubs spending millions on prevention. So why isn't it working? Well, our guest today might have just the answers. Dr. Dave Hancock has been head physio at Leeds, Chelsea, worked at 2 World Cups with England, director of performance at the New York Knicks, and led rehab for some of the biggest stars in global sport. He's now CEO of Apollo, an athlete management system used across the Premier League, NFL, MLB, and beyond. So Dave, thank you very much for joining us. You have worked in the Premier League, and I think the way to start this podcast will be, did you enjoy your time in the Premier League, and where has it now taken you?
Yeah, I did. Thanks for having us, Adrian and Stephen. Really good to be here. Yeah, I did enjoy. I actually missed the Premier League, if I'm really honest with you. I missed the day-to-day, although I think it's changed a little bit. I missed the day-to-day interaction with players, managers, looking forward to the games, so either midweek in Europe and the weekends. But it's been quite a long time since I've done that, so I've sort of moved on a little bit. But my however many years that was working in the Premier League, I think from 94 to 2008, I was in football. So that's quite a long time.
Yeah.
And then a little bit after with the national team, but I really, really enjoyed it. And I must admit, I do miss it.
Yeah, I think one of the big things we started this podcast out was to give people information behind the scenes, and I know you have been listening to it. You hopefully have been enjoying what we've been trying to put out there, but it's just, I think, the understanding of how much impact injuries do have on a team, and your time as being successful as a physio or as a team that you were working for. How important is it that you do keep your major players on the playing field to make sure that it does bring success?
It can devastate and lose a manager a job. And you can see that time after time, season to season, where, at the top level or even for survival, if your top players aren't available, then the coach hasn't got the ammunition to go and win. And we all know it's the talent on the field that wins. So depth of squads. So now you see Arsenal, for instance, spending more money on their depth of their squad. But if you haven't got that finances to do that, then losing 2 or 3 of your top players can be devastating, especially a striker. At the end of the day, if you haven't got a decent striker, then part of the process is to score a goal. So I've seen it. I've been involved with it. I've been in situations where we've had injuries that have caused us to nearly go down, and situations where we had a healthy squad and won the Premier League. So my view is that there's got to be more attention paid to this. And I think the medical and performance teams are under a tremendous amount of pressure. But I think there needs to be, a complete reviews within clubs, which I think clubs are starting to do now, about where they are and what they're doing, and accountability across everything from coaching through to medical and performance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was going to say is there an element of when you talk about they are trying to change it, is there an understanding at times of actually how much money is being spent on players that are sat in a changing room, i.e. the cost of what they've come in for, fee, and the wages being spent week in, week out? Or is that just is it almost forgotten about and it's just the players in there and we just got to deal with it?
Well, obviously, if you're an owner, you're going to be looking at the balance sheet. and the cost of having that player on 300,000 a week or whatever they're on, and how many days that they're missing. But from a medical perspective, you should be treating everyone exactly the same across the squad, in my view. You shouldn't have priorities to X or Y. The goal is how many of these players can we keep available for the game, which is the most important thing. And then second is the training or the practice. So those availability stats across the season, and looking at periodizations of fixtures should be, part and parcel of what you do as a performance team.
Dave, there's been a lot of talk about there being an injury epidemic in football. Would you agree that injuries have reached epidemic proportions?
Yeah, I I I think we're getting there, and I think we're definitely getting there on soft tissue injuries. I think there's certain injuries that you can't really prevent. If someone goes through you in a 50-50 challenge and they take out your ankle, and there's not much you're going to do when you've got a 180-pound athlete coming at you at 22 miles an hour and coming through you with his feet and his studs up, and you go over your ankle, you damage your ankle, or you tear your ACL. There's not a great deal, in my view, you can do about those contact injuries. But I think there's a lot you can do around the soft tissue injuries. And as you said, hamstrings as an example, but other injuries like Achilles, calf, and groin are going up. And I honestly feel like we have a tremendous amount of data now, but we haven't really identified what are the reasons why these things are occurring.
But that's kind of a follow-up. Why do you think the injuries have reached the levels that they've reached?
So definitely the game's faster. So Stephen, when we worked together, the game is definitely faster now than what it was when you were playing. That's a fact, and all the data tells us that. But the athlete's much better now, right? They're more prepared. Their nutrition's better. Their recovery's better. They're doing things now around, recovery sessions and having cryogenics and looking at specifics, macros and micronutrients, as you discussed in previous podcasts. So that level is all improved, right? So the athlete's become a much better professional athlete. But what hasn't improved is the number of soft tissues that are occurring. And my honest view is that we're missing something. We really are missing something. I think a lot of people have got on this bandwagon of doing various different tests to collect data, monitor training, and I think it's definitely worthwhile doing, and it gives us some objectivity. But that objectivity that we're collecting isn't reducing the injury rates. And therefore, my own personal view, and obviously now I'm running a software company, so I'm looking at millions of data points every day, and we're assisting teams on what they want to look at. But I don't actually think that they're nailing down the big reasons why. I
So
think
what do you think they are missing then?
So my honest view is that I think that they're missing a lot around the way that the body stabilizes and mobilizes. My view is that athletes will get injured and they'll rehabilitate and they'll get back and play, but they will never be the same athlete in the way they move prior to that injury. So if you've had surgery or you've had an injury, you won't move the same, and your rate of recovery and healing takes months and months. Well, we haven't got months, right? The job is of the physio or the doctor or the performance team is to get you back as quick and as safe as possible. But your body's still adapting to that ligament strain or the surgery that you've had or the scarring or the neurological inputs or all the things that you do to develop and heal from any injury. But you will never move the same. And what I believe is that your body's a great adapter. But that adaptation over time, in my view, leads to what we call dysfunction. It leads to things that the small little intricacies of way that your joints might change in the way it moves, things that your neural firing to that muscle might change in the way it moves. And I think some athletes are really good at adapting, and I think other athletes aren't good at adapting. And I think that there's more research that we need to do around the way that an athlete actually moves and controls his body, because doesn't matter what you're measuring with regard load and intensity and accelerations and decelerations and all the inputs that your body is doing. But if your body can't function at the highest level and can stabilize to allow a joint to mobilize, then you're going to end up putting unwanted stress somewhere within your body or within what we call the kinetic chain. A great example is, if you need to run, you need to have good stability around your pelvis and your lumbar spine, right? To allow your hips and your knees and your ankles to move. You have to have good fluent neural firing. Well, if you can't stabilize correctly through your spine on your pelvis, you will cheat. The body will find a way to move. It will adapt. And I think there's more into this than actually taking a measurement about a test. So now a lot of people do like jump tests, counter movement jump tests. They do isometric tests. They measure strength in certain planes. But you're only measuring something in one isolation, whereas the body moves as a whole kinetic chain.
Yeah.
So if you can't stabilize around, for instance, the lumbar spine or the pelvis, then it doesn't matter how strong you are. If you can't stabilize to allow something to mobilize, that movement, you're going to cheat because the body will always find a way to move. Another example would in an ankle, right? So if you went over on your ankle and your ligaments are healing, you will get your range of movement back in your ankle, but your ankle is quite a functional three-dimensional movement, and it won't be moving the same as what it was prior. So now your ankle going up, your kinematics have changed, and it might be slight changes, but if you then compound that over months and months and months, and we classically see where you have an athlete that's got injured, right? So I'm sure fans or people listening to this podcast will have, this guy can't get a break. He got this injury, and then ever since then, he's been injured with this and injured with that and injured with that, and he's come back. He's got another injury. Why? Well, for me, that's to do with the way that his body is trying to move, and he hasn't got all the building blocks in place to stabilize certain joints to allow other joints to mobilize.
Would the case in point be Rodri at the moment?
I don't know the ins and outs of Rodri's situation, if I'm really honest.
I just mean the fact that he's come back from an ACL and then he's had a few niggles on the way back, and I think it looked like he broke down with his hamstring against Brentford. And is that part of the process then of what you're saying?
In my view, I've seen that with athletes 100%, and I've made mistakes with athletes because obviously 10, 15, 20 years ago, I don't know what I know now. So my whole thing is that this is something that people aren't looking at enough. They've got this whole data implosion of looking at all of these sets, and they're looking at, and obviously recovery and using objectivity or objective data to return athletes is important. I'm not saying it isn't, but just because someone can press against the machine and he's strong, and the left leg is as strong as the right leg, that doesn't mean anything to do with stability. And you can be strong, but if you can't stabilize to allow something to mobilize, which is how the body works, you can end up then finding a different pathway. And in my views, it's those pathways that can sometimes are missed, sometimes aren't looked at.
So at the moment you've got, and we'll just go back to one of your former clubs, and they've got round about 10 injuries at the moment. How would you manage that then? So how do you get the staff to perform on a daily basis, making sure that the 9 players who've picked up injuries are all working in and around that? Is there enough staff for them?
So there is a tremendous amount of staff now within football teams, okay? But my view is the way that the staff model is wrong, okay? So when you were playing and we were working in the teams, you had your medical team and you had your sports science and you had strength and conditioning. So you got these 3 different teams and they all interact, and the better teams obviously interact better and the communication is better and they get better results. But in my view, what should happen is you should have an injury prevention team, and that team purely works the players that are fit, okay? And they work alongside the S&C and the sports science team. and they basically are working from a manual therapy perspective. They are working with corrective exercise. They are working with players to make sure that individually they have their own programs, but that's led by a medical practitioner, someone who understands pathology, someone who understands mechanics, not a sports scientist or a strength and conditioning coach who will understand strength, but not on the same level as a physio. And that's the bit that I think needs to happen. And I think it is. I think it is happening. But what tends to happen is that, well, the physio can do that, and then the physios have got to look after the injured players as well. And for the amount of money that is now being spent, I just think they have to have a better strategy within their clubs around prevention models. And then you need to use data to show that what you're actually doing is actually working. Because if you took teams like, for instance, let's take Arsenal or my old club, right? If you looked at the injuries and the soft tissue injuries that you have at Chelsea or Arsenal, year on year on year, they're not going down. So you have to turn around and go, why? And what tends to happen in sport is everyone blames everyone else. Wow, they played 60 games or they played 80 games. And they did this on international. That was nothing to do with us. And it's like, well, who cares? Like, everyone's in the same boat. You're in Europe. Everyone's playing the same amount of games. Everyone wants to try and win the same amount of trophies. What are we doing to change our philosophy? And by changing our philosophy, does our philosophy change? Do we need to tweak our philosophy and then look at what the outcome is? It's like any business, right? If you're trying to drive a business or run a company, you're going to look at your P&L. Can I afford this? Can I not afford it? Where are we losing money? Where can we say it's no different? It's data driving the success of where the bus needs to go. And involved in that is also the coach. So with Mourinho, for instance, at Chelsea, one of the reasons that, in my view, that we were successful wasn't because we had a great medical team. One of the reasons that the first time when Jose was there was that he was so good at periodization in training that we didn't have many injuries. And he was so good at it. And he was ahead of his time then. Now, obviously, things have changed and, lots of people have sort of got on that bandwagon.
Yeah.
But he was so good at periodizing, knowing when to push, knowing when to pull back. And that was the art of a great coach. So he had a lot of players available to it. More players available to him, the more he can utilize, rotate squads, you start winning trophies. And not winning trophies one season, back-to-back seasons.
Within that periodization, how much did he lead that himself, Mourinho, and how much did he take on board the views of the staff that he had around him?
It was all him. I'll give you an example. I heard stories, not just like when, for instance, when he was at Real Madrid, people like Cristiano Ronaldo would refuse to wear a GPS chip. Not interested in the data. It was like his model of what they were doing was more important than the data. Okay. So everyone goes on about, well, we need the data. I'm not disagreeing with it at all because it helps. But his art, and it was an art of way that he would periodize his training, was so significant to that success in the early first time round at Chelsea, for sure.
So what would the typical week look like under him then, when you're saying he was just naturally gifted at it? What was he so good at? And then,
so he would phase the training days. So there would be a theme around certain days, and obviously he periodized depending on if we were playing midweek in Europe or we were playing at the weekend. And one of those days might be neural. So everything he did in training and in warm up was around neural activation. So everything was quick and fast, and it was like literally 40 minutes, you're back in the dressing room. It wasn't this, 90 minutes, we've got this to go through, that to go. No, in and out. Bum, 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 bum. That was like one day. And then other days, there would be like a strength day, and everything around a strength day would be body strength. It will be contact. And the way that he would manipulate the pitch in looking at intensities, but also contact. So that would be the way that he would introduce strength. But he wasn't interested in, 45 minutes in the gym. He was doing the strength out on the pitch. Now, I'm obviously going back 2006, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, it's quite a long time ago. In my view, working with so many other managers in my career, he was revolutionary at what he did. And when I looked at it, I was like, and everyone would pat themselves on the back. Yeah, we've done a great job. Yeah, of course we did a great job, but we weren't doing anything that was proactive. We were very reactive. He was the guy at that time being proactive. And I think more clubs need to be proactive, but not just within the department. It has to be a collective. You have to have the coach, the sports scientist, the strength and conditioning, the medical team. You have to all be into this philosophy about what are we doing here and how do we look at this information and learn from the information that we've got. Because if the numbers keep going up, something's wrong. If I'm at Arsenal, I'm the manager, and I keep getting 5-6 hamstrings a season, something's not right. But you've got to look at yourself as well as look at everyone else, rather than going back to the old traditional football where you blame people. You have to look about why. What is it?
Do you think there's an element then of a fear to be the different, as in the ones who step away from the norm and do something different?
Massive. The problem in sport, and it's always been a problem, okay, is that people are in fear of their jobs, okay, and people want to stay in their lane. And I always say within any sports team, you've got two different types of people. You've got the innovators and you've got the survivors. And every club needs both, 100%. But the clubs that have more survivors than innovators are normally the clubs that just sort of do this. My view is you need innovation. You need to constantly be challenging the norm. And if you're not challenging the norm, then you're just doing what everyone else is doing. And sometimes, in my scenarios, you could end up losing your job for it, or you get into discussions or an argument about it, but you've got to push the boundaries because that's what the coaches do. Yeah, that's what Jurgen Klopp would do. That's what these top coaches do. They push. And I think performance and looking at injury, people have to do that. They have to be asking them, looking themselves in the mirror, if you like, and saying, look, what are we doing wrong here? How do we change this? What is it that we're missing? Can we open the doors? Because a lot of times people don't want people from outside of their departments. They feel threatened. Bring someone else in from outside to have a look at this. Again, that's being innovative, not being threatened. But unfortunately, with the amount of pressure, salaries even now for medical people, performance people want the badge, people want the kudos, people want to be in that environment, people want to be on the stage at conferences, people want to be bigging themselves up on LinkedIn, social media. It's like, it's what people want. People strive for it. Once they get there, they don't want to lose it by saying the wrong thing or treading on the wrong toes.
Yeah.
So do you think that's a big driver of the injuries that we're seeing, is that lack of collaboration within clubs and that lack of communication between departments?
I think that there's a lot of smoke. And I think that a lot of people can take numbers and data and statistics and screw it to whatever they want to prove a point. But if you look at the bottom line, is how many games are being missed through, for instance, soft tissue injuries. That's the bottom line. You can make any excuse, any statistic to back up your theory. But if you're looking at it longitudinally, if you're looking at over 3, 4, 5 seasons, and you're constantly having these issues, some intervention, something needs to happen. It's no point in just saying, well, he was unlucky. I used it back in the day, he's just unlucky. Now I look at that and think, no, he's not unlucky. We could have done something better there. We could have had an effect there. We could have changed that. But like I said, it takes mavericks to do that. It takes innovators to do that. And a lot of people don't like to challenge the norm when they get to the top because they just want to stay at the top. And in my career, the people that I've worked with, and Adrian, Steve, even outside of football, I've been really fortunate to meet some incredible billionaires, owners, CEOs, musicians, actors, like top of the game. And the one thing that I've sort of seen with all of them is that they keep pushing. They keep innovating. right? The things that they do, like U2, they innovate. McCartney keeps on working and working and working. Madonna, like these are top of they've made it. But why are they at the top of their game year on year on years? Because they keep innovating, they keep changing.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot of lessons coming out of sport and working with these different areas to see that. And it's quite invigorating. It's quite, when you see what actually goes on behind the scenes with these people and these operations, you can see why. Why are they still at the top? So, I mean, that's just obviously my own personal view on this.
So how did things change for you when you left the Premier League, you left soccer, you went to America? How did you see things differently? And does it have a different setup when you went into, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, you went into the basketball first, was it?
Yeah.
And was that completely different going into that sport and seeing the setup behind the scenes in America?
Yeah. So first thing was the number of games that we were playing. So, you're playing every other day, you're traveling, you're on back-to-backs. So, you're getting at 3 a.m. and you've got to play the next evening. The mentality of the American athletes is very different from Premier League soccer players. Their backgrounds, the majority of their backgrounds are quite different. So their upbringings are different, right? Most of them are from single families, they've had to grind and work. I found that the American athletes were a lot tougher, that they would just run through injuries but
Interesting.
they were also, elements of them were, depending on the athlete, elements of them in the off season, they took a lot more ownership of their bodies and what they did and have teams around them. Now that's changing because in soccer, this is now happening, right?
Yeah.
A lot of top athletes have their own teams outside of the club. But obviously I'm talking about 2008 when I went as the performance director at the Knicks. And what I did was I just sort of sat back for a year. And for instance, I was the first guy to bring catapult into the NBA. No one had heard of it. And I was like, I just want to quantify what these guys are actually doing. So now I am using objective data to just look at what they actually do, because then they had nothing.
Yeah.
Football was way ahead of the ball, was way ahead of the mark when it comes to sports science and data and integration. Like, it was far superior. But my view is, I think if you understand movement and you understand coaching and you understand the way that the body adapts, the way the body trains, exercise physiology, psychology, all the things that go into making up any athlete, if you sit and observe it long enough and you're in it long enough, you can start to learn it. And that's basically what I did probably for the first year. And then I had a little bit of freedom to go and headhunt and bring certain people on board. So I went and got Andy Barr, who was at Manchester City. I brought him over because I wanted to try this injury prevention strategy. As I said to you, I brought in GPS. So I was doing other things. I'm doing some collaborations with Nike, where we'd bring the Nike lab in to do some screening on the athletes and just trying to look at it slightly differently.
Were you given full reign then by the club to do that?
Pretty much. I think they were pretty much. I think what their view was that they wanted someone with a different mindset.
Yeah.
They wanted someone that wasn't in their bubble. And I think we changed a lot of things in the NBA. Look, now most people are doing, not just me. I mean, a collaborative of the team. And it was quite exciting because you are seeing how things evolve, but you're also learning. You're learning off athletes, learning off great professionals like Jason Kidd, like an incredible guy, an incredible player. But you just learn little things that I wouldn't necessarily see in the Premier League.
Yeah.
So it was a great experience. I was there for 7 years. It was a really great experience. But like everything, it comes with politics, comes with dealing with owners. It's no different. It comes with the nuances. And I was just fortunate that some of the people who are still there today at the Knicks were good, great people. And that's like the bottom line, is that you have to work with great, like-minded people. If you haven't got that within your team and you've got egos and other things that can get in the way, it becomes really difficult, because then you get more involved in managing people rather than actually managing the athletes.
So tell us about what you're doing now and what Apollo is, because I'm fascinated by this, because Lammy's given me a little bit of a background on this, and I can't wait for people to hear this.
So I was a co-founder. Apollo was always my idea, but obviously in sport, I never really had the time to do it. And there was an innovative company in Leeds when you were at Leeds with me, Steve, called Prozone. And Prozone revolutionized the way that we would look at the physical elements and even tactical elements of what went on in the game. It was a camera system that looked at the way that players move on the pitch, the connections between like the back four and how the back four moved in a defensive position. It would trace the movements. And I started using it very early to like, I remember taking Michael Bridges out, for instance, and I looked at a simulation of what Michael did in a game, and I tried to replicate that in my late stage rehab. So I was using what he actually did as a centre forward, and then Robbie Fowler, it's completely different. He played a different way. So I was showing them the traces and the movements and trying to set up drills for return to play for what they are actually doing a game. Right. So it was really innovative. I went to the guy that created that and he sold the company. And I said, look, I've got an idea where I think we should start. There's a lot more innovation coming. And I think we should centralize the data because at the minute I'm using 3 or 4 different systems to do my job. We set the company up and pretty much it was run like a mum and pop shop. We signed a few clients, lost a few clients, but we didn't really go for it. And over that time period, a lot of players came on scene with the sort of athlete management systems, and I was using them in the space. And I found that some of the systems were clunky. They didn't do necessarily what I wanted to do with the data. They wouldn't visualize the data. I wanted to do it to have an effect on the coach or change things because things can get quite complicated with data. So the visualization part of data is really important to tell a story, to make a change. And going back to what we originally talked about was that you need to influence a change within your environment. So if you can do that visually, you're halfway there with a coach, right? Coaches aren't really interested in the algorithms or the ins and outs. It's like, how can I
show me?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And a great example, right, was at the Knicks where we didn't have any, like this is all new. And I had a 60-year-old coach who was an old school coach, played in the NBA, coached in the NBA, great guy, great team. But all of a sudden there's this English guy coming in and telling them about these numbers. And he's looking at me like, they used to call me the Grim Reaper, right? Because I used to come in and try to educate the coaches. But what I was able to do is I was able to show them a really simple visualization to basically say, look, the way that you're training these guys and these superstars in this point of this season, if you keep going like this is at massive risk. And if it's at massive risk and you lose your superstar, you're probably going to be out of a job.
Yeah.
Because we don't score without Carmelo Anthony. And if Carmelo Anthony's not on the court, we ain't going to score. Fact. That's what the data is telling us. So I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just showing you some evidence here about how we could tweak what we're doing from information that he didn't. And I did it in such a simplistic way that he bought in. And then sort of evolved what we actually built now at Apollo. So the idea is that we have like a Lego set because every organization, every coach, when you change coaches, they have a different mentality, different philosophy, different idea of visualizing something. So the software needs to change to adapt for the change. The problem with the software that's on the market, they can't change because they're built like boxes. And you can tweak 1 or 2 things in the box, but you can't completely dismantle the box and rebuild a different box.
Yeah.
So, and that's what we've done in Apollo. We've put these systems around the area to make people's lives easier and to adapt and build very quickly using things like Tableau, Power BI, R, Python around what someone wants. And then we've built out these different modules so you can start interconnecting between scheduling, sports science, strength and conditioning, medical, well-being, psychology, nutrition, coaching. So these all departments, scouting. So now you can have it as a centralized system for within a club, or you can just have 1 or 2 modules depending on budgets, depending on what you want to do as a club. And we've been growing really fast. And now I put this module into Apollo which is sort of my IP around this thing called a blind screen. And this is sort of 15 years of me looking at the way that the body moves, looking at basically these injuries and trying to sort of say, well, what would I do different if I was back, you know, in the field like I was in the Premier League so many years ago?
Yeah. So
Brilliant.
go on.
So,
I'll let Lammy explain the blind one, because you explained this to me. I thought it was great.
I explained it, and obviously, David, I want you to go into detail with how you came up with it and explain what it is. But the way I explained it to Warnie was, it's kind of like an Agatha Christie murder mystery when I saw it demonstrated. And just to describe the scene, so Dave's demonstrating it in a room full of strength and conditioning coaches and physiotherapists and doctors and coaching staff and everyone involved with the team. And it's a whodunit. And there's an athlete in, and Dave runs through the screen, which I'll get Dave to describe it, but it's asking the athlete to move in different ways, walk away from me, walk back, raise your right leg, balance, close your eyes, all of these different tests. And I'm observing this, but I'm also observing the coaches and the physios, and everybody's kind of looking around. Nobody really knows. We know there's a murderer in the room, but we don't know who it is. And after he runs a test for 45 minutes, and at the end of it, he says, "Okay." A big moment of truth. The reveal.
By the way, just to break in before this, you don't know the history of the player, though, do you?
No, this is the.
So
this
that's the key. I don't talk to the player.
Yeah, and then so he's never met he's a complete athlete. He's never met, doesn't know, and then he says, "Right, what problems have you had with your right knee?" And the look of surprise on the athlete's face was, "Well, yeah, I've had 5 meniscal tears on my right knee." Yeah, I thought so, because because your left oblique is weak, and because of this, and links in the chain, and everybody in the room I almost spontaneously burst out into applause, and everybody was it was like all the rest of it. And then you explained how it was, and it was incredibly powerful. And in terms of the things that you've spoken about earlier in this conversation, Dave, in terms of the bits that people are missing and an over-reliance on pure testing and data and missing that intuitive way. So if you could just explain to us all what the blind screen is, kind of how you came up with it, and why it might make a difference.
Yeah. So about 15 years ago, and I've been a physio now for 35 years. And about 15 years ago, I got really bored of it. I was like, give me this, or ACL or Achilles rupture or this, that, and the other. Like, yeah, I can rehab it. And you get a massive toolbox, and you get different skills, and you get good at assessing. And like anyone, like a surgeon or anyone, a pianist, anyone who's been doing it for long enough, right, gets a level, a skill level. No different from you being a footballer, Steve. And you just get an awareness, and et cetera, et cetera. But I got bored of it. And I kept asking myself, like, I see these injuries, and I'd see these big name athletes, like, you know, ruptured this or done that and had surgery. I'm like, why has that happened? Why? Why has it happened? Not, yeah, I can fix it, but so can thousands of other physios fix it. So can any physio in the Premier League fix it. Fixing it is not it's difficult, but many people can do that. That's easy. Preventing it is harder, much, much harder. So I started wondering, my philosophy is that the body will always move. You get injured, you're going to move. You have an operation, you're going to get out of bed, you're going to move. Athletes move faster than the normal public because that's what they do and that's what they love. So they're going to push. Okay. And your body will always move away from pain, and it will always move away from tightness or restriction. It will find a way to move. Right? That's fact. And you ask any medical person, surgeon, doctor, physio, trainer, strength, anyone, that is fact. And then I started thinking about, all right, so all these tests and all this data that we're collecting, all the tests that we do are what we call non-functional tests. You're sitting down, you're squeezing against something, you're jumping up and down, but that's not how you jump in a game. That's not how you head a ball. That's not how you
Yeah.
jump to take a catch, right? So all the tests we do, even though the data is useful, it's not function. It's not what you actually do in the sport, okay? And the body finding that way to move moves as a kinetic chain, right? It moves from head all the way to the foot. So there's the brain, there's the neurological inputs, there's the firing, there's the stability, there's the power, the generation, all the things that happen to allow a body or an athlete to move, to perform. And I think a lot of injuries occur around what we call rotational planes, right? So there's a lot of elements of joints. So the knee rotates, the hip rotates, the back will rotate. So elements of rotation. And with rotation, you get a lot more force, okay? Rather than just using a hinge,
Yeah.
rotation, you get a lot more force production. And I believe that a lot of injuries occur around rotational planes. So what I started doing was I started taking bits and pieces from some of the world leaders that I've been fortunate enough to work with, people like Mark Comerford, Diane Lee, people in my field that are known as the best, especially around movement. And then that 35 years or so of watching people move and walk and sit and stand. And I started putting together my own sort of movement screen. And then I would examine someone head to toe, but I would also look at all the things that I've learned around neural plasticity, around how does the nerve fire? The nerve, is it tight? Because a lot of people don't do that, right? And I started then thinking, well, like a vet, right? They can't speak to a dog or a horse, but they can treat them and they can work out what's going wrong. I wonder if I could do the same with athletes. So I started basically not talking to people, which was nice.
That's tough for you, Dave.
Yeah, for them or for you?
Wife loved it. I started screening people blind. Okay. And then at the end of it, I'd come up with like a jigsaw puzzle or a checklist, and I'd go, right, this is what I found. This is weak. This isn't firing. This nerve is tight. This joint is restricted. This joint isn't stabilizing when you do that test. And what I started finding was, and then I'd ask them, right, now tell me about all the injuries that you've had as an athlete. And what I started finding was that what I was finding was related to the things that happened to them in the past that made sense. I'll give you an example. A very famous NFL player that I screened about 4 years ago. Remember, I didn't know anything about him. And he tore his ACL and he was having a problem with his hamstring on the opposite side. And I was screening him and he had a massive amount of what we call neural tension. So there was tightness within his nerve, but he also had a collapse of one of the segments of his spine. So his spine wasn't stabilizing. It was compressing on the nerve and therefore causing restriction on the nerve moving. Well, nerves can move like tendons or muscles. And therefore, for me, that was like a big, what I call driver. But no one was looking at that. They were treating the hamstring. They were strengthening the hamstring. They were doing all the things that you do reactive to treat a hamstring. But I'm going about the why. So I started putting a program together for this guy. And lo and behold, I tracked everything he did for 4 years and he never had a hamstring problem since. Now, that's one scenario. I'm not saying that this is the be end or end all, but I think when you're in the environments that I've been in, you can become quite clouded in what you do and because you're with these people every day.
Yeah.
And I think by not knowing anything, you are trying to find something and you can identify things that can help people with their own individual programs. So then after doing probably now 1,500 screens on athletes and Joe Public, I started then obviously run a software company. I started then talking to my data scientists here and saying, how can we build a model to learn this, to learn the risk, to automatically that I could come into a medical department and teach you how this screen would work. You put the data into the software system and it gives you an outcome, gives you all the things you need to do, gives you the exercises, but also gives you a risk. And what we've been doing is every athlete we've been putting into the system, we've been tracking their availability stats. We've been tracking their history. We've been tracking the feedback from the medical teams. And we've done, some pretty important teams now on these screens, and people that have been having injury problems or injury crises.
Yeah.
And we found different things that they haven't found on these athletes that I'm not saying can cure them, but can definitely help. Right. So another good friend of ours, for instance, right, who we both know, he again had I screened him a number of years ago, and a lot of the issues that I find come around spinal, pelvic stability. And that's not something in football that you're necessarily looking at in depth. Either you don't have the knowledge to do it, or you just, it's one of those things, well, he can do a plank or a side plank, he's good. But it's not about that. It's
Yeah.
about, his spine and his pelvis work in sync and stabilize? And is there any restriction in the nerve, for instance? Because if there is, that could have a detrimental effect. No matter how strong the muscle is, it's the nerve that drives the muscle. It's the joint that could be compressed on the nerve. It could be something so slight that there's intricacies that this is the area that the individual needs to work on. And now we've been putting this into this AI model, and we're basically, we just literally, like AD said, we just went to a big American football program in California and screened. So it's quite interesting for me because it's something for me, my own personal IP.
Yeah.
It's something that I used, 15 years ago to sort of challenge my views about the why. And so far I've been getting pretty good feedback from it. It's fascinating. I did a Major League Baseball player on Friday, and everything that goes in, you just like, now tell me what your problems are. And you're like,
Really.
So it's very interesting. I'm not saying that this is the be or end all, because it's not. There's a lot more factors that go around: fatigue, training loads, that all of that takes point. But my view is, if you're not robust enough to do all of those loads, and you don't start with making someone robust, it doesn't matter about your periodization of training. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Because, if you're pushing and pushing them, which is what they normally do, you're pushing yourself in a game. If your chassis, if you like, isn't quite up to par, the car's not going to move the way you want it to move.
Of course. Yeah. I think the interesting thing about that is that with the NFL player you were talking about there, if you are picking up repetitive injuries and you only treat that area and it's not working, there is an element of, well, I will try something different, and then you start to see the results of it. So yeah, it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's no, very interesting.
One of the ones from me then, Dave, is obviously we've both worked in similar sort of backgrounds in sport, and certainly I've seen a movement, and you're much more experienced than I am on this. Is that there's been a real shift towards pure objective data, pure numbers. How high can they jump? How much can they lift? How fast do they run? Do you think that's come at the expense, and some of the subjective stuff has been pushed out, and we're losing some of those really important skills are drifting out of the game from an experience point of view? Or what's your view on that?
Yeah. I think people are becoming too much black box scientists, sitting behind this objective, because they're basically having a conversation with someone who doesn't understand the data. Right. And like I said to you, a while ago, you can skew numbers and statistics to back up what you're saying. Many people can do that. Even in research, you can do that. Right.
Yeah.
So you can always back up that objectivity, but there's this human element, right? There's this personal relationship, psychology, right? Of actually working with someone and understanding how someone thinks and talks and how they interact and emotion, because all that can have an effect on injury, right? I've had players from the Premier League. I remember one guy, he was depressed. And the best thing that could happen in this scenario was that he came to New York. I wasn't really doing anything different from what the team was doing. But the fact he got out of that environment, out of that bubble, and no one realized it, it pushed him up.
Yeah.
And that human element and that human interaction in sport is so important. I always used to think, like, I've been really fortunate. I've worked with people like Phil Jackson, Jose, Terry Venables, top coaches, Capello. You can go on and on. But the best ones for me are the ones who are really great at psychology. And sometimes you
Yeah.
don't even know that they're doing it, right? Um, and a lot of times people will go on about the coachings and the tactics and that. But my view is most of these athletes at the top level know how to play the sport. You don't, Stephen. When you played, you didn't need to know what you were doing in your position, right? What you needed to do is make someone making you feel fantastic. You're going to run through a brick wall on a Saturday when you're going to go and play, and you feel
Yeah.
confident enough amongst the people that were in your team, and someone's driving all of that. That's you're 80% there winning the game before you've even gone on the field.
Yeah.
And
100%.
that's it. When you got scientists and strength coaches that are just sitting behind numbers, that bit for me is being lost.
Well, I mean, we had Dr. Steve McNally on. He was obviously my doctor when I broke my leg 3 times. And one of his big things was, and you just spoke about one of the players coming out to New York. His big thing was we had the Liverpool Academy was separate to the first team, and he would try and change my environment every few weeks. Just because he was like, you don't need to see these same 4 walls every single day because it will drive you insane. And it was about changing the environment as much as possible. And it was just like you say there, that human element is massive.
Huge. And it's a shame because, obviously I haven't been in the sport for a while, but at the end of the day, it's still the ball, it's still a grass field, and it's still 2 goals, right? That hasn't changed. So the human element and the way that sort of everyone's got bogged down with testing, I think there's a happy medium. I think there's a seesaw between subjective and objective. And I think what's important is that, like in our software, for instance, we try to collect subjective and overlap it with objective. So we have voice to text where a coach can just talk and all the data from the subjective can come in and you can overlap it with GPS data or any other data that you want. But your opinion matters because your experiences, like the Jose scenario I was telling you about back in the day, like his opinion obviously hugely mattered, right? Because he's the expert there. So does everyone else. They're all experts within it. So there is this really fine balance between subjective and objective information, really fine balance. And I think anyone that's going more towards objective needs to probably bring the seesaw back a little bit and think about the subjective, your opinion, right? I'll give you an example. Friday, I had a phone call from a guy that's on my board, and his son is a top quarterback within college. And he said to me, look, could you just have a look at him for me? I had a look at him, and I was, my subjective was like, something's not quite right here. So the next thing you do is you go for a scan, et cetera, et cetera. But before all that, I'm having a conversation with the dad, with the coach, about what could be the scenarios here. But I gave my subjective view. I didn't go straight, well, let's just wait and see on this. I said, look, this is what I think. And then I went to the objective, which was the scan, to back up or go against what my view was. And that's the way that this, within data, within injury prevention, within sport, that's for me is that seesaw where there's got to be an equilibrium, a yin and a yang. And if you have one too much one way, I think you can just get bogged down in it. I really do.
Yeah. But going back to a point you made earlier, depending on the environment within or the culture within the club, sometimes offering a subjective opinion is difficult.
Very difficult. I mean, but you should be, what should happen is you should be in an environment of work where you can air your subjective opinion and not get trounced on.
Yeah.
And that's the culture. Okay. Like I go back to the innovators and the survivors. The survivors wouldn't say nothing. They sit on the fence all day long. Nothing. But you're not moving the environment forward if you haven't got a place where you can at least give your opinion, whether it's, taken on board or not, no issues, but at least you can give your opinion. And then you can learn from it. There's a great story, Steve. I don't know if you knew this story, but when Peter Reid came in at Leeds United, we were really down the bottom of the table. And we were needing to win. Okay. And Reedy had sacked a number of physios when he was at Sunderland and other teams, right? So he came in with this reputation that he'll be out the door.
Yeah.
And I was young. I was like 28, 29. And Lucas Adibi got this horrendous ankle injury. So I said, I worked night and day, so did the rest of the team, to try and get him feet. And we're playing Liverpool away. I'll never forget this lesson. And I said to him, look, let's just treat Chief. I said, look, let's just wheel him out and do a fitness test on the Saturday morning. Anyway, he was playing up against Michael Owen. And his ankle was like huge, right? And we'd done everything we could, but I took him out and I did one-on-ones with him. I'm megging him. I'm going round him, me. And I'm like, Peter Reid's come out and I'm there with the doc and we're at the side of this hotel doing this fitness test on Saturday morning. And I was like, there's no way he could play. I mean, he'll get crucified. And obviously we want to win the game. So after about 10 minutes, I thought, give it another 5 minutes, keep going. 25 minutes into this fitness test, Reedy comes over. I said, I'm just shaking my head at him. I said, Chief, you're not right, are you? And he's like, yeah, another 5 minutes, another 5 minutes. And I said to Reedy, I said, boss, it's this suicide. So anyway, pulled Lucas over, went over into the corner and he came back, walked straight past him and he went, he's playing. And I went, coach, I said, like, no, this is suicide. He's playing. I was fuming. I was absolutely livid, right? And anyone who knows me, the mad dog came out, okay? So anyway, I said to the doc, Doc, and Doc's obviously one of those you see on the fence, if he wants to play, and Lucas wants to play, what can we do? I'm like, he's going to be off in 5 minutes. So then I'm like, okay, I got on the bus, I was folding my arms, I was in a bad mood. I was like, how dare him overrule me medically, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so I got him, strapped his ankle up. I went out, I got him in a hot bath, I was mobilised, doing everything I could possibly can. He had almost like a plaster cast of an ankle support arm. Steve, he had Michael Owen in his back pocket for 90 minutes of the game. I sat on the bench at Anfield and I'm like, how has he done this, right? I remember taking the strapping off and the thing just blew up like a camel's hoof, right, after, okay? But I think we drew the game, so we got a point at Anfield, right? We're in survival mode. But I learned a great lesson. And then afterwards, Reedy came on the bus. He went, I told you it'd be all right. Just walked straight past me. But it was a great lesson because, you can air your opinion, but not to take that too serious. And back then I was upset because I was being overruled. But I aired my opinion and it was overruled and for the right reason. And, you don't know. And the human body in that element is telling me, you actually, things can happen that is way beyond what you actually think. And not to really, all you can do is you can air that view. But I was in an environment with him, with the manager, that I could air it, but at that particular time. So I learned a really good lesson from that way back in my 20s that, look, don't take that too personal. He's got a job.
Was the moral of the story was that you're a better striker than Michael Owen? And you could have been a Ballon d'Or winner. Is that why you told the story? Because you nutmegged Lucas?
Not been as quick. But he had a few hamstring injuries anyway, didn't he?
Yeah. Brilliant. Oh.
Yeah.
Class. Well, I think that is as good a way to end the podcast as anything. Absolutely brilliant. But Dave, thank you so much for coming on. We appreciate it. We're glad that you listen. It means a lot to us that you listen, and obviously you give a lot of feedback to Lammy about how things are going, and we appreciate that. But this has been another episode of Strain on the Game. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me, and congratulations to you both for a brilliant podcast. I love listening every week.
Oh, you're a top man. Cheers, Dave. Thank you.
Hey, guys.
Follow us on social media and YouTube at Strain on the Game. Subscribe, like, and follow.